Okay, welcome viewers. My name is Charlotte Gray. I'm a senior at Middlebury College, and I would like to introduce this episode's guest speaker.
Thank you very much. My name is Bryan Rich. I graduated from Middlebury in 1987. I was a February freshman. I'm currently a managing director at Accenture Federal Services, and I lead the AI applied intelligence business. Accenture is a large global consulting firm. We're, I think, more and more considered a technology company, and the federal business is specifically geared towards supporting the federal government, agencies within the federal government, and primarily around more and more digital transformation and the integration of things like RPA, artificial intelligence, machine learning, into how the government is rethinking how they're supporting citizens, agencies like the IRS. We're deep into many parts of the federal government in terms of how they're using data science, computer science, technology, to kind of rethink and reimagine kind of how government can work.
That's cool. So your specific role at Accenture is with AI and robotics. What specifically does your team do as that helps with the federal government?
So I joined Accenture about 2 years ago, and I'd previously been in a series of startup companies, primarily focused on data science. And the goal really was to consolidate all of the advanced analytics, data science, machine learning, AI, robotic process automation into a single kind of business group. So I founded something called Applied Intelligence within Accenture Federal. So I'm kind of like a business within a business. We were about 200 people in September of 2018. We're currently 700 people. So there's just been amazing growth in the space over the last 2 years. A lot of that driven by kind of the government's shift to the cloud and moving away from trying to manage technology and applications on premise and taking advantage of all the compute and cloud computing available, if you digitize in the cloud. So we're a large business within federal, probably around 15,000 employees. But more and more we're seeing, the entire convergence between consulting, technology, and data. It's just been a tremendous accelerated convergence as the technology gets better and cheaper.
So you mentioned that you didn't necessarily have a technology background, and when I was LinkedIn stalking you for preparation for this, I saw that you did English and Latin American studies, and then went to do the School of Journalism at Harvard, which seems really fascinating and cool. And what's most fascinating and cool about that is that about like 10 years later, or 8 years later, I think, you ended up at the head of a technology company. And I'm just so fascinated to understand like how that career path sort of got started for you. How do you feel like you kind of got set on that direction? Did you always feel like you were going to go into technology, or were you thinking English and Latin American studies?
I was a poetry major.
Poetry. Okay, excellent. Okay, great.
No, I'm actually amazed. So I started out, I was really into text analytics. I loved
like natural language processing type things.
No, just it didn't exist. I wrote my thesis on a typewriter.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool. Very cool.
So it was a long time ago. Actually, no, maybe there was one computer room at Middlebury, but you had a floppy disk and it was command line. But I actually think I did write it on anyway, I can't remember. Anyway, my thesis was a book of poems, but I was really interested in text analytics, like in old school, like quantifying the, using the patterns in text to quantify, to elicit more meaning from the text.
Mm. So even when you were in this humanities focus, you were still kind of thinking about it in a
No, but the whole idea didn't exist. Computers, the idea of using a computer to count didn't exist.
Right. But the idea of like thinking about this as like what we would now call a data set, but what you were thinking of then was just text. You're still thinking about it in an analytic way, which I think is very cool.
So I left Middlebury. I went to Alaska for a year and crab fished.
Cool.
Then I traveled around Central America for a year. I moved to Brooklyn in 1989, I think, and wanted to be a filmmaker. So I started working on film sets,
Cool.
which is really weird because I'm going to explain the connection. It's so all the terms on a film set, like gaffer,
Mhm.
best boy, all of these are whaling terms. And so
Oh yeah, they are.
what used to happen in like 19th century England is that the whaling fleets would come in and they'd work in the theaters in the winter, rigging all the theaters. That's why you had so much, like all that swinging, weird 19th century British drama, you know, people flying around the theaters.
Interesting. I was
So when I got to New York, I started working as a gaffer, or no, a best boy on films. And then I wanted to be a cameraman. So I started shooting 16mm movies. And then I got kind of burned out after 2 years working in the film industry. And I worked on some award-winning films. The whole New York film scene at that point was like emerging. And so
I was actually a theater major for 3 years, and people were always like, interesting, theater and computer. Well, I started as theater and math, and then I was theater and computer science, and now I'm computer science and math. But people were always like,
right.
Theater and computer science, like, how does that fit together? And I was like, I can't explain it. I just really like both of them. So I think it's an interesting thing to hear that someone else also has that same sort of excitement about the data and the math and the numbers and the things like that, but also film and theater. That's so cool, that creativeness. Did you work on
the
anything
connection?
you might have heard of?
Yeah, I mean, there are these non-obvious connections between things. And so anyway, I ended up going into TV news and then started thinking that if I could count certain features of news, I could start to deconstruct influence within news reporting. And so I started doing this. It's a long story. I ended up in Africa running like a news organization, but I didn't speak the languages that the reporters were publishing content in. So I hired a team of translators to provide metadata about the reports. Who did they quote? What was their ethnicity? What was their religion? Were they military or religious? Were they male or female? And then to characterize the statements that the reporters were using. Was it like economics, conflict, human rights, whatever? And so I realized as I started pushing these this metadata through Excel that it was like a Polaroid developing about each of my reporters. I could see where their bias was. I could see connections between different data points, right? Like gender and human rights, or one ethnicity and quoting the military. And so these patterns, this became what I call pattern detection. I used to manage these reporters. I had about 50 reporters working with me. This was in Burundi after the genocide in Rwanda. So the sensitivity around the content of reporting was very high because of the role that radio played in triggering the genocide in Rwanda.
Yeah.
And so Nightline came and did a story about what I was working on. And one of the reporters, Nightline used to be an important news program. And actually Andrea Koppel, the daughter of Ted Koppel, who was, anyway, it's a long story. So he saw these, this TV news reporter came and he saw the charts about each journalist on the wall. And he said, what are those? And I said, well, I quantify, you know, the attribution of all my reporters and who they're quoting and with what frequency. And I use that to make sure that we're kind of balanced. And he said, whoa. So he said, can I take some copies of these? And I said, sure. So he was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. He had been a Nieman Fellow. And he showed them to Bill Kovach, who was the curator, the former managing director of the New York Times. And so they called me up and said, we really want you to apply. We've never seen anything like this before in terms of, you know, using data to inform editorial judgment.
Yeah.
So I went to Harvard and I spent the entire year just conceiving of differential equations that could be extracted from the models that I'd been building. And then I started to automate them with a friend of mine who I grew up with. Can I just stop this for 1 second? My mother's in the middle of chemotherapy and she's
Oh,
texting me. Hold on.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Hold on. I'm going to mute.
Totally fine. We'll cut back to it in a second, whenever. Everything okay? We can
Anyway,
all.
so I spent a year at Harvard just basically launching a business, or launching the framework and the roadmap for a business. My next door neighbor growing up had started to work with former computer science team from the Mir space station in Russia.
Oh, wow.
And so I sent them like this framework, and within like a month, we had a relatively autonomous online portal that could essentially go through news reporting and extract, the metadata that I cared about, and then convert those individual intelligence about the stories. And so a good example would be, we took the cover of 15 major newspapers in the US, just their front page stories every day for a month. And you'd start to see significant differences in, the amount of women quoted, how often they quote AT&T versus Comcast, for example. You start to see patterns in attribution that clearly was not accidental, right? They were steady patterns in journalist behavior. And then we could also see, we added corporate ownership as a meta data point, right? And you could actually see very strong differences between just the corporations. And so, it was like pretty cool. So I thought, okay, I'm going to become a billionaire in about 6 months. And went around and tried to sell this. I couldn't find any customers within the news business because they thought it was creepy that I was spying on their reporters. And I was like, I'm just reporting on your reporting. Like you should understand that if you want to connect with, if 60% of the women in a specific zip code are buying your newspaper, you should make sure that you are representing women as a part of the community. It's just, and so anyway, it became a very frustrating couple of years because I was so excited. But when you're a poetry major and you start a data science business, it doesn't necessarily go quickly. So I kind of went back to TV production for a couple of years. And then one of the people that I'd showed my data models to after 9/11 called me and said, okay, I think, I have a customer who might be interested in looking at these patterns. So, obviously the federal government was interested in looking at patterns of bad actors.
Of course. Yeah. Right? I mean, that's a huge, like the targeting of,
yeah, and this was before social media. I think this is 2001, right?
Right.
So, and so, I spent the next kind of 12 years building a business from that. And we did a lot of corporate work, Fortune 500 companies, foreign governments, US government. And I sold that business in 2014 to the Carlyle-backed Novetta Carlyle Group, and spent 2 years there, and then was recruited into Accenture in 2018. But it's been a very interesting trajectory. The people that are working for me are so much better at all parts of this. But I think what I learn is kind of just, resilience and creative thinking about problems. I mean, I had to overcome some significant weaknesses in my own skills, right? I'm not very good at math.
Sure.
Science and math were not big parts of my education. And so I think that almost forced me to develop, different senses around storytelling with data. How do you quickly come up with a combination of data points that would give you a highly accurate inferred outcome? I mean, there are all these ways that you can kind of get to good pretty quickly. And a lot of data scientists spend time trying to get to perfect, and they'll spend a lot of time getting to perfect,
Yeah.
and they won't even ever get to good, right? And so I think that's where the liberal arts kind of mindset really does allow you to look at things in a slightly different way. Don't get
That's
me wrong, I work with brilliant problem-solving people,
Mhm.
but I feel that in a way, I'm kind of like a blind person with math. I've developed other skills for
Absolutely.
quantifying information. And so
Exactly.
it's been interesting. And COVID was actually a pretty interesting example of that. I told my team exactly how, the differential equations that we needed to use quickly,
Mhm.
and they resisted and resisted and resisted for weeks. And I'm like, let's just do it this way. And as soon as we did it the way I was recommending, they couldn't believe that kind of my model combined with their mathematics yielded a much better outcome.
Yeah.
So, it is, it's been an interesting trajectory. Creative people are able to think in concepts.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a big advantage, because you're able to, if you can think quickly conceptually, I think it gives you an edge in terms of leadership in
Mhm.
general, but it also gives you the ability as a practitioner to kind of, um, provide a relatively quick solution to a variety of problems, right? And then
Right.
your technically smarter, proficient people can kind of vet the different concepts quickly. But I think it's a very important um, skill or ability, especially as this convergence takes place.
If you
Okay.
have any, like, what skill sets are important to have? We've obviously talked about like creativity and
Mhm.
adaptability and curiosity. What type of experiences, if you're talking to maybe a Middlebury student who um, is like thinking about what they might want to do for their career, obviously you're walking evidence of the fact that what you do right when you get out of college could be completely different from what you end up doing as like
Mhm.
the rest of your career. But if you, as a person who makes the hiring decisions often, what's stuff that you look for that you think makes people more informed on the subject that they're like applying for, or the role they're applying for, or things that when you see someone that has this on their resume, this person must really be interested in this because this is like a marker of someone who's really passionate about it. So like internships or research or things like that, like what's stuff that sticks out to you? What could you recommend to middle grade
So I'd
students?
say, first of all, don't be bullied into conformity, right? Like, there's a lot of pressure when, you've spent tons of money on your education to graduate and immediately be like, okay, I need to get on the treadmill and start. I think it's really important to acquire skills. You're going to learn the same, potentially even better work ethics as a carpenter, right?
Mhm. Right.
Than you will interning in something that you already know a little bit about. I think it's important to like stretch yourself by doing things that may seem maybe non-intuitive and non-connected. But when I graduated, I just wanted to like clear my brain and use my body and, do something physically challenging. But
Mhm.
in doing that, like working on a crab boat requires an insane amount of like just focus for
Yeah.
safety,
Yeah.
stamina, physical stamina for work, and adaptation, because you're constantly dealing with conditions that are changing and often, you know, a little bit dangerous.
Mhm.
And so like looking back at like that was one of the best experiences for what I'm doing currently, right? It just you get this alertness that is critical to survival if you're working in a crab boat, but it helps you kind of understand what's going on around you, and that situational awareness is great no matter what you're doing. So I'm not saying you can't get it and you can't get trained, in it, but I think it's a much more fun and adventurous way
Absolutely.
to obtain that skill.
Yeah.
And it's not that, it could be anything. It could be working in a national park but
Mhm.
things that are just, you know, where the urgency and the physical demands and the stamina are just so intense. It creates like it just gives you um, tremendous resilience, which is very important, right? Especially if you're going to pursue highly competitive. If you're going to be an entrepreneur or data scientist, I mean, it just takes trial and error all the time. I mean, some people, maybe it comes easily, but I really look for people who, to your point, they've had maybe a more elliptical path. They didn't necessarily go from A to B and just get their PhD and then come out and they're ready to work. I look for people, one guy I hired was manager of a minor league baseball team, right? I was like, that's awesome. You're going to be a great leader of people. I've hired many soldiers because, they've been in situations probably a lot more dangerous than crab fishing, but it's some of the same, ability to collaborate under pressure, physical stamina, focus, those are things that are really important. They're not necessarily technical, but they're dimensions to, what I call star athletes. They all seem to have these specific characteristics. I would say relationships are the most critical thing. The ability to build relationships, even over long periods of time, maintain them. Your network of people is critical. Like if I need to find someone now, like a specific kind of person, I have a network of people that I've been working with, collaborating with, staying in touch with, for years. And the ability to kind of build that trust and maintain it, even though sometimes you're competing against each other at different companies. Sometimes your lives become very different, but relationships is a critical feature of success. You can't do anything alone. Like it's just impossible. And then the third, I think, is like responsiveness. You have to be responsive. It doesn't matter what job you're in. If someone asks you to do something or you're working with a colleague or you want to collaborate, if you're not responsive, you're a terrible collaborator. And if you're a terrible collaborator, you're not going to be able to build kind of a brand within the world in which you're working and competing. You want people to rely on you and to be able to trust you. And a lot of that is about how responsive you are and the quality of the work you do. So, investing yourself heavily in those three areas for me, I mean, I didn't start out thinking about these things, but as I look back, I would say those are, kind of, and then there's a lot of luck and there's a normal, like I met a guy, or a woman. And so, but I think you can increase the statistical probability of good fortune.
Okay. If you go work
by, so it's not, I mean, things are never an accident. So all you really need to do is behave in a way that will statistically increase the probability of something good happening. And so, I look for candidates that just have, a wide range of experiences, because frankly, that's much more fun to talk about in interviews than like, what did you write your thesis on? I mean, that's interesting, but, I'm really interested in people. And I think that's important because you want to put together an interesting community of people. You don't want to just hire, this same shaped person. And I think, it's not just about diversity and inclusion and, all the really important, talent acquisition principles. It has to be a fun, interesting place to work. So you need fun, interesting people. But I think, Accenture is a fantastic company.
Yeah.
Conversely, coming out of college and coming to a place like Accenture gives you some pretty interesting perspective on, what corporate culture is like. And I think it prepares you to do just about anything, because our focus on delivery and collaboration and the diversity and community that, I mean, I'm like amazed. Like I always was afraid to come, not afraid. I was always rejected the idea of coming to work for large corporations.
Yeah.
Because I just felt I had all these assumptions about, I would never fit in. I would never be able to operate within this hierarchical, rigid structure. And really, I'm completely shocked. Accenture is like a giant startup.
Do you have any career, what's the best piece of career advice you have ever gotten? We'll maybe close on that one. The best piece of career advice you've ever gotten.
Listening is really important. It's just, I can't stress how much confusion occurs in a short period of time because people aren't focused listeners. And it's even harder now because of multitasking. And so, being present, I think, is already pretty difficult. You might be nervous or you're under pressure, or, you're being asked to do things you may not, know how to do perfectly. Now we're kind of like, all of us are mentally in 3 or 4 places at once, right? Or 3 or 4 mediums of communication.
Mhm.
And so, the ability to just really be present and listening, I think is even, it's more and more important, especially I think at the beginning of your career where, the trajectory of your success is going to be based on how well you understand what's expected of you.
Mhm.
And if you haven't been paying attention, you're not going to be able to execute.
Do that. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again for your engagement with us and helping students kind of prepare for their career destinations. This is concluding the episode within the series. In closing, I would like to encourage viewers to tune in to get career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in the series. I also want to encourage you to tune in to the other MIDDVantage series, which could be accessed through the events and programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you again for watching.